If you want to read better and think more clearly and understand the ideas shaping our world, then this might be for you. You should join the Dr. John Patrick Book Club. It's a private online community where we read great books together and learn how to think, not just what to think. Inside, you're going to have access to Dr. John Patrick as we work through books and ask questions. If you've ever felt like there are books you should be reading or ideas that you want to understand better, but you didn't want to do it alone, this is a good place to start. You can find the link in the show notes or the description below to join.
Hello, everyone. I've had education on my mind this week, coming at me from various directions. People dying, and then you start thinking about how you interacted with them and how they interacted with you and what you shared. More and more conversations with neighbors, farming, and the worries about having people make decisions about what the nature of farming is and know nothing about it. Perhaps the most common one in this area is the recognition that boys in rural schools, but I think it's across the board, can't wait to get out of school. I don't see why they should wait, because all it's being used for is propaganda. A bunch of academics living in cloud cuckoo land are not the people who should be deciding what educational policy looks like. In education is to prepare children for life. And for Christian boys and non-Christian as well, for boys in the country, they would much prefer to be working on the farm than sitting in class listening to stuff they don't like and don't think is important. One of the people who died just recently is a guy who used to cut my hay for me. And he told me, he said, as soon as I got to the age where I could leave school legally, I said I wanted to. My dad said, that's fine, but you're going to start milking at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning. And he said, that's fine. So he spent his life in that context, like many rural boys. And he enjoyed it. He felt he was doing something that mattered. He had real knowledge of what had to be done when on the farm, which is critical in Canada, where you only have a 90-day growing period. If you don't get everything in at the right time, you don't get a crop. The amount of tacit knowledge that rural farmers have is astonishing. They know and love their farms. They don't look at pictures taken from space and decide what ought to be done, which is increasingly the way it's going. We had a lovely example of that nonsense around here not so very long ago, when two young ladies from Toronto in an SUV that had never been off-road turned up at one of my neighbours' farms and said, we want to look at part of your farm. And they said, there's a stream there which we think is not being properly used. And he looked at them and said, oh yeah, where? And he realized that they had misinterpreted the data they'd got. And so he said, well, go ahead. I have no objection to you going and having a look. It's over there. And he pointed in the direction, and off they set in their SUV. He knew perfectly well that even their four-wheel drive SUV was going to be stuck within about 100 yards, which it was. And then they had to come back in their nice city clothes, getting mud all over them, and say, please, will you pull us out? And he said, only when you've been to Toronto and got permission for me to do that in triplicate. They didn't want Toronto to know what they'd done, so they had to get a tow truck to come and pull them out at their own expense. The arrogance of not discussing with the farmer as though he might know more about his farm than they do. They have their frameworks, their protocols, their procedures. And the procedures and protocols don't bend the knee to facts. The facts have to bend to the procedures. That's ridiculous. you can go on my farm, for instance, on one stretch. We have about 300 trees that were all planted on the same day to provide a windbreak against the east wind, which was very cold and interfered with cross-country skiing years ago. And they were put in as, 6-inch things. They're now 30, 40 feet high. But they're all planted on the same day, but they're not all the same size by any means. Because the geology is interesting, and there's a layer that has strange characteristics, and it effectively limits how deep the taproot can go until the taproot gets through in the end, but it doesn't get through equally. So where the problem is a bit thicker, those trees are, a third of the height of the other trees, all planted the same day, same farm. Would by any little girl looking at a map in Toronto, taken from the sky, would treat them as a particular category, but they're not. Farms can change in 30 meters or less. And you'll see sometimes when you're driving, one corner's just not cultivated. The farmer knows he'd never get a crop out of that corner. Sometimes he knows why, sometimes he doesn't know. But he does know that he won't get a crop out of that corner. So tacit local knowledge is being lost. When a big company takes over, you've already got to the stage where they're thinking more about when to sell, when to trade, how much money can we make out of this. The farmer doesn't think that way about his farm. In most cases, he loves it, and he knows every corner of it. Boys with that kind of upbringing, that kind of culture, go off to school and are bombarded with ill thought out propaganda, basically, in many respects. Talking to fathers at the moment, he said, well, I wish the kids could get out and work on the farm much earlier. And I think they should be allowed to. Then they can go back to college if they want to later on, if they really want to learn something. If you said to them, you've got to be able to do this much arithmetic, maybe some algebra, you've got to have read these books, and you've got to be able to read a passage and show that you understand it. And you can do that. If you want to go and work, you can. Come back later if you need to. An awful lot of boys would actually be motivated to do that bit so that they could actually do, and they might find they're more interested in it than they realized. But they've been given a motivation that fits in their way of looking at the world. They know that in 99% of cases, they're not attracted to other boys, they're attracted to girls, and vice versa. But they're taught that 4% of the population have to be treated as though they're exactly the same as everyone else, but there's no discussion at any stage of what the differences are in outcome between different lifestyles. And my goodness, lifestyles matter. We all know that. We accept that if you drink too much, you're going to pay a big price. Shortened life, job insecurity, etc., etc. Now, if your particular vice happens to fit with a particularly privileged set of society, you can do what the homosexual movement has done in my lifetime, where you go to Regent Street in London and it's full of pride flags, but they can't put the red cross of St. George up. And at Christmas, you can't say Christmas anymore. There's something profoundly arrogant about that. And so that's at the back of my mind. Clearly, many parents are realizing how bad it is, and they're doing home and Christian schooling, hated by the educational establishment. But real universities are already realizing that home and Christian school kids are good students. They want them. They bend their own rules to get them in if they're good. And of course, unless they're good, we don't say go on. For most homeschool Christian school kids, if your kids are literate, numerate, and polite, by age 11, you're way ahead of the curve. Uh, those three things could make as the criteria for whether the ideas of the Faculty of Education are worth implementing or not. Because, of course, from the beginning of education as a public activity, we didn't have faculties of education telling us what to do. I'm absolutely in favor of research on outcomes, but I'm not in favor of people who've got ill thought out ideas which they treat as fundamental. I've seen how disastrous that can be with Popper's approach to science. That science, he said, had to be disprovable. Nobody does science in order to disprove. Well, some people are out to get their colleagues and want to try and disprove it, but that isn't the motivation that gets you out of bed in the morning. And it can't be described in a way that the Faculty of Education can do its second-rate statistics. I love that moment when Jordan Peterson took down one such journalist in England, and he said, "You do know about multivariate analysis, don't you?" Because she came up with the old chestnut of women getting paid less for the same work, but they don't do the same work. The moment you factor into the equations hours worked rather than some mythical same, it turns out that men are paid less than women. Just adding one more variable other than gender. So unless we can train our young people, the best of them, to a very high level, we need highly trained Christians who can do their job well and can take down the idiocies that they meet along the way. But we have got to take back education. As I said, I think if I had my way, I would say that any boy in particular, I would, girls, I'm not so sure. I'll leave their own sex to decide for them. But I know that boys come to life when they say, you got to take that engine to pieces and put it together again. That they would absolutely love, and they will read the manual to do it. I remember years ago where I used to help with the Boys Brigade in London, and one of the deals is they had to come to Sunday school if they wanted to go on the various activities that were organised. The one that I was involved with was rock climbing, my passion at that stage. But it was interesting to see how bad their education had been. But once I realised what the problem was, and we started talking about it, the idea that taking an engine to pieces, put it together again, would require reading, and that even to do with my Sunday school class, they had to do some reading, but they had a reason to do it. And it was a very enjoyable experience. One of the nice bits was the little runts of the class were often quite nimble. So it's a bit cruel, but I would get the class tough who thought he could do everything and take him up a climb that he couldn't do. And he'd have to say, I can't do this, let me down at the limb, and then take a little run to scamper up it without any trouble at all. A great leveling moment. Reality. Go back to Miss Minnie if you don't know about Miss Minnie, Wendell Berry's teacher in Watch With Me, who knew that her job was to teach children what to love. She loved children and she loved books, and she taught by merely introducing the one to the other. And probably what you're doing today has got something to do with a teacher who loved you and loved the subject. And the two things go together in the end. But the Faculty of Education doesn't know how to quantify that because it's not quantifiable at one level. The immaterial realities of life have to be put first. So in your home, for instance, one of my, I have to get it right, great-grandsons decided he was going to put a cell phone in the garbage, and everybody was hunting. Fortunately, the bag was plastic, and when we pulled it out, there it was. So it was found. I'm actually missing mine at the moment. I hope he didn't get a hold of that and put it somewhere as well. But there you go. He's being loved primarily, but he's also being trained in discipline because they want to follow what's going on around them. So they put their hands together and close their eyes and say grace together. That's what we all do, and they want to do the same. This is at the heart of Judaism. The Jews are by far and away, in terms of number, the most successful culture on earth and the most resilient one. And they take it all back to, if you will keep this law and teach it to your children, keeping it on your heart and transmitting it to theirs, you will flourish. A narrative that can support flourishing. That's what the promise is. We abide in that narrative. That's what it means, to do as Christ would do. What would Jesus do? Yes, the bracelets were tacky, but there's a genuine truth there as well. It's not unreasonable, isn't it? Is it? You get yourselves in situations you don't know what to do. And what would Jesus do is not a bad question at all. Hard to answer because he didn't give dogmatic, doctrinaire responses. Somebody would say, well, I've kept the law. And Jesus said, you love your neighbor? And he knew he was caught. So he said, who is my neighbor? And Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan, which is probably one of the most well-known stories worldwide. He didn't lecture the guy. In fact, he went away sorrowful because he knew that he had a lot of wealth that people should be using in different ways. With great wealth comes great responsibility. If you deny that, your life will fall apart. If you try to use it properly, you can make real contributions to society. And our education has to teach these things. I often refer to Fogel, the Nobel Prize-winning economist from the University of Chicago, who said to me around 2000 that the commodity that's going to determine whether or not America succeeds is trust. He said, we began this experiment in America with a set of propositions which were all Judeo-Christian in origin, Protestant Christian, not Catholic as it happens, because a hierarchical system couldn't be transposed into the initial state of America because people went off and no roads, no trains, no telephones. They marched off westwards and plonked themselves down in various places, formed little communities. The first thing they did was put together a church, and that was the place where they would have discussions. And they learned to solve their own problems, the American can-do approach. And it's still there in small-town America. It's not there in New York and LA, where all sorts of twisted ideologies are wrecking people's lives. But getting the ordering of the goods right is very important. They're not laid out like a smorgasbord. Yes, tolerance is something that you should exercise, but tolerance is nowhere near the top of the list of things that should determine what you do. Hopefully, you don't tolerate child abuse. You don't tolerate murder. No, it's not even really a virtue. It's the oil to keep the virtues running together, if you want an analogy. No, and whether you put loyalty or truth at the top of the list, it's going to make a difference. Yeah, companies want loyalty, but if that loyalty stops people speaking truthfully when it needs to be spoken, that company will not do well in the long run. But they sell off when they see it's going wrong and move on and leave somebody else to pick up the rubbish, if it's pickable up. But if you've done it right in the first place, would be very different. And we take all that stuff as though we did it, and we didn't. It was a gift, particularly the ordering of the goods. Islamic society demands obedience and loyalty to Islam above all else. And that allows you to lie against an infidel. In fact, you're told to do so if it will advance the cause of Islam. They make nothing. They try to make some case for having done science, but they were great observers of the heavens, which herding people in the desert before there was light contamination. They sat there watching, and they saw, and they realized there were some stars, the planets, which move regularly. Others seem to be fixed. They got that right. They didn't do the physics. This was observation. They gave various star patterns names. That was the way they functioned. So they did good observational astronomy. They did some mathematics, but at least one of their best mathematicians had to go and live as far away as he can, as in fact most of their really talented intellectuals, their first requirement was to get as far from the imams as possible. One of them, whose name I've currently forgotten, was a brilliant man, but he didn't follow Islamic rules. Every day was a bottle of wine. And didn't stop him doing what he did. He laughed at his teachers before he was a teenager, saying, I've read all that stuff. I know that. I know more than you do. And he was right. He did. And Avicenna, Ibn Rushd, always getting them wrong. No, Ibn Sina. He wrote the canon of medicine, which was wrong, but gave at least a sense of knowing something that lasted, or no other medical textbook will last as long as his canon of medicine. But it was wrong. But since we had no treatment that worked anyway, it didn't much matter. And it did have some stuff in that gave people a means to handle a large amount of data. But once the scientific breakthrough into reductionist thought happened, it was gone in a very short time. Primarily, it disappeared quite late in the 19th century when, at long last, doctors could actually make a difference. They didn't make a difference until then. Before that, our profession depended upon the fact that people knew they were sick and they wanted to know what was happening and what might happen to them next. And you can't see patients every day without learning what's happening in terms of local infections. You see diseases, you say, I've seen this, I know what happens. You're going to be all right, or you're going to die, whatever. And knowing what's going to happen, almost invariably when you tell the truth to a patient under those circumstances, they'll say thank you, even when the news is bad, because they know what they've got to do. And of course, in the modern world, most frequently we can do something about it, much more than we used to. So what I'm saying at this stage is that underlying successful cultures are a set of ideas, moral ideas, and they differ by culture. Whenever anybody talks about race, say, I don't talk about race. Let's talk about culture, because that's what matters. There's a difference in Britain between working class culture and the upper crust. And the upper crust were totally out of control with their sexuality and their selfishness. And the working class were blessed in one sense that the only book they actually knew was the Bible. And they lived, by and large, very moral lives. They drank too much, they smoked too much, they did all the usual things, but fundamentally they knew that there was a real moral truth. Now, of course, your values, my values, but the end of that. And the person who brought values language to us, of course, was Nietzsche, and that ought to be enough to make you worried. So, intuitively, many parents, Christian parents in particular, but not only Christian parents, are realizing that the way the education system is being manipulated for political purposes is not a good idea. So home and Christian schooling and non-Christian schooling with real intellectual intentions is coming back. I think we should do some very basic medicine within the church as well. And I've been reading this week this book, The Third Education Revolution, and the main author is Mangal Wadi, assisted by David Marshall. It's a series of essays. Mangal Wadi was born in a Hindu family in India during the time of the Raj. He went to university, which was, of course, run on British principles, Judeo-Christian principles, got educated and loved it, and then realized the things I really love come from Judeo-Christianity. He became a Christian and spent his life living with the poor and defending them against rapacious landlords, but also traveling and speaking quite a lot. And his big project at the moment is to develop education outside of the state, because the state always wants to use education for its purposes. So home and Christian schooling is a start. He wants to bring a lot of education back into the church, where, yes, we teach, but we teach within that context, as Harvard did with Veritas over the door. All the great universities, the Ivy League, they were Christian foundations, and they're failing now because they've lost their raison d'etre, their foundations. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's a truism and a statement people trot off without really thinking about it at all, and they need to. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. If there is no power above us, and Darwin is right, we're a product of time plus chance, then our lives are meaningless, and we can only do what makes us feel better. Objective reality? Perhaps. But easily pushed aside. And of course, as I've said it, and will go on saying, the growth in the ethics industry is merely a reflection of the fact that we're becoming unethical. Hugely so. I mean, I've just this morning looked up the annual corruption index. You can find it online. I've forgotten the exact title now. I have to look it up every time. Short-term memory is not what it used to be. But interestingly enough, it's done as a map at one point, so you can see immediately. And the Judeo-Christian world has very significantly better ethics than the rest of the world. But we're falling apart. We're backtracking. The US is no longer in the top category. It's in the next category. Corruption is growing. Canada's rates are dropping steadily. I didn't have time to go through all the individual countries. But when that goes, when you start applying technical solutions to moral problems, you tie yourself in knots, because it's almost impossible to do. And unfortunately, we buy into the idea that we could teach ethics without thinking clearly enough about what would be involved in doing that. And essentially, if you don't start young, it's going to be very difficult. Because I maintain that ethics are caught, not taught. And Jesus he talked about character. He talked about our souls, our relationship to God, the nature of sin, why he came, etc., etc. These aren't things that can be quantified. And Paul's ethics, all his epistles were written because of ethical problems. Bad sexuality, You go on laziness, each of the epistles, intellectual laziness and physical laziness. So in each case, he writes to the church and he does a whole chunk of theology. And then his ethics comes down usually to three things: love your spouse, love your children, pay your workers. You could hardly make a course out of that, could you? But you can make a course out of what comes before it. And we have stopped taking really serious Bible studies. And our churches, many of them, particularly the evangelical stripe, are lacking in content. I think if I could do it, I would love to put inlaid on every preaching point. I've lost the name for the lectern, on every lectern in front of the preacher. The verse from Nehemiah 8, they read from the law clearly and made sure the people understood. That's it. That's what should be happening every Sunday morning. Read from the Bible clearly and make sure the people understand. And it's a very good idea to have a lectionary so that you don't become selective in what you read. And you get through all the scriptures in due course. I'd take a little bit of a rest from the hoobigats, but there's not much in scripture that fits in that category. You need a good Jew to teach the hoobigats. And I was stopped in my tracks at one point because a woman came up to me after a lecture and she said, "I've been praying for you for a long while. I didn't know who you were, but I've been praying for men of Issachar, and you're one of them." I didn't know what she was talking about. I had to get her to explain. And it's when David catalogued what his resources are. And, so many swords, so many spears, etc., all the usual things. But when it comes to Issachar, it says, the men of Issachar understood the times and knew what Israel must do. So it was a lovely compliment in a way, and a shake-up because I'd never seen the verse. I must have seen it at some point, but it hadn't penetrated my numbskull head. But it did then. If you can't take back what are your fundamental principles and find a base for them in Scripture, you're in trouble. We have no basis for justice if there is no God who's going to judge us. It's important. And what do your promises mean if there's no judgment? What people say to them in front of other people and say we're going to love one another for life without any discussion of what's involved in that. It's not just a procedure. At best, it changes your life. My wife and I made promises to one another which we both intend to keep. You can't produce feelings, but you can have rules that you believe to be true and good, and therefore you will do it. There's a lovely viral clip, actually, that Ben Shapiro took of Peter Kraft talking about his wife who recently died. And as Peter Kraft is, he spoke very ironically about getting old and what that involves. And his wife ended up in care. And then she died. And he said, when he looked at her, he realized, if I met her again, I'd fall in love. And we'd do it again. It hadn't been easy the last part, with more and more people living longer and having to deal with particularly Alzheimer's, dementia, which, I'm on that spectrum at some point. My mother died of Alzheimer's, and I certainly don't have the memory I used to have. But even there, I have learnt relatively recently that good education would have a lot more memorization. There was lots of memorization in my education. It hadn't been infected by the Faculty of Education at that point. Children love chanting their times tables. they don't realize that they're getting a sense of number in the process. And mental arithmetic at the dining room table is fun. Children like puzzles. They like challenges, as long as doesn't get nasty. What we memorize matters. I mean, watching my pre-language great-grandchildren, she's second time around, third time really, acquire understanding before they can verbalize. But they're going to pick up a language in 2 or 3 years with no formal training. I had many years of French and it never really penetrated. It should have been done in much more, on the ground terms. I spent a lot of time wandering the countryside. We didn't have a television, didn't even have a telephone. I read books, lots of them, didn't think anything about it. At least one a week, unrelated to school. And I didn't take any notes at school that I can remember. I did what was asked in the class, and that was it. I didn't have a bag of books to carry around. I had a head, and I remembered. I didn't know that was a gift. I do now. I didn't use it as well as I should. But thank God for my mother and my teachers who realized I had that capacity, and they encouraged it. So I didn't learn verses. I learned chunks of scripture that made sense as a whole. That children can do it, and they love doing it. And you are putting into their heads at that time a future for which they will truly bless you. So Mangal Wadi and his friends want to do much more than just Christian and homeschooling. He knows that we need a much deeper re-grounding, a repairing of the foundations. I once heard him describe his first trip to Holland. I've done this on this podcast before, so those of you who've heard it can tune out for a minute. But he got to Holland and he was staying with a family in a rural area, and they ran out of milk. And they got, we'll go get some. Just go for a walk across the road to the farm. So off they went to the farm, and there was no one around. He went to the dairy. He brought a jug with him. He filled up the jug. He put the money in a box on top of the shelf and walked out. And I go, what's happening here? He said in India there'd be no money, no milk, and probably no cows. But you can leave the box with money and people can take their milk and they pay for it. I'm sure there were some thieves, some cheats, but minuscule. Now, in our 20 years in the country, over that period, we've gone from the point where you could buy good pies, home-baked, at the gate. You could pick up corn and potatoes and various things, apples, with nobody there. People would put money in the box. That's stopping because thieves are destroying it. Because they're not ashamed. They even have political people who say you have a right to it because you were colonized and it was all stolen from you. That's an amazingly manipulative and dangerous way to think. But it's where we've got to. So that's why Mangal Wadi says we need to run our own university level teaching based in the church, where it will be related to life as it is, and we can listen with other people to great teachers It's all available online in one place or another now, but online on your own won't work. But you can use good online material to develop a real conversation about what's going on. And you can relate it to your faith. We have a foundation. This is not our home. We seek a city whose builder and maker is God. That can be taught at convenient times. If everybody left school at 15, except those 2 or 3%, perhaps 4% of the population who would go on to so-called higher education, which at one level it is, and it's important to educate them as well as possible so that they can be useful to society, which they are. The very best are from a different planet, but they make our planet different. And so a lot of history ought to be taught, which isn't taught properly at the moment. History taught as though we are the product of Judeo-Christian thought, which we are. Just ask your children or at school or even university, what do these names have in common? Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Boyle, Faraday, Clerk Maxwell, Eddington. You won't get a right answer. They are, of course, all physicists with cosmology part of them, but not much cosmology from Faraday, and they're all Christian. Now, Clerk Maxwell came from a very privileged background. Faraday came from a very poor background. He had no mathematical training, and that's why he invented the first electric motor, because he looked where other people were trying to produce models based on straight line thinking, and he saw that current passed through a wire in a magnetic field. The wire tried to turn, and in one day he invented the electric motor. It's a lovely Faraday lecture. You can find it on YouTube. Christmas lectures for children in the Royal Institute, Faraday lectures. And the day that Faraday made the first electric motor was in the last few years. An American did a wonderful job. It's important to know these things. Then we come to what we do, what we're going to need to do in other areas. I mean, in the country, we're very old-fashioned. People do things for one another. They don't want to be paid because they know it's going to go back the other way at some point. It's part of the culture. It's Christian. And it's getting lost. You know, I was talking to one of the guys who comes to the men's group I attend on Saturday morning, and he said when he was a young man, there were 6 Sunday school classes every Sunday. Now there's none. That's what television and uncontrolled sport. I mean, yeah, I love sport too, performance, but it's become more like the games in Rome. As long as they have sports and they have food, the government can get on doing what it wants. The fact that politicians don't sacrifice money when they go into politics in most cases. Somehow they seem to be quite well off at the end of it all. They don't really need to vote themselves the magnificent pensions they do. But that's where we're at. I noticed one other thing in this area over the last few weeks. There's some really low-class writing on YouTube, but it's pulp fiction or worse. And I've been interested in the phenomenon of stories that people read, mainly women actually, that you can totally predict what's going to happen after the first 2 or 3 sentences. But they do tell us something. And I've noticed that there's quite a following for stories that are totally formulaic. They're usually female success stories, chief executive officers of successful companies, and guys whose spouse has left them either because of tragedy or because of divorce or whatever, who are devoting their lives to bringing up their children and looking for jobs that fit in with that priority. And these guys are good guys. Standardly, the CEO at some point will ask, "Why did you do that? You didn't get anything out of it." He said, "Because it was the right thing to do." And usually, there's some tacky marriage at the end. But they're looking for some depth to life. And they're beginning to recognize that it's things that you can't measure that matter most in life. And they matter for companies as well as for families and relationships. And if we don't teach our children the literature that teaches them this, we have robbed them of their heritage. I don't think they should be reading lots of pro-homosexual literature. I mean, they've only been around as a political force for less than half a century, really. And there's not much good to show for it. And they have attacked great literature because it didn't have anything to say about them. Shakespeare, we all used to learn chunks of it. It's good to do that. To be or not to be. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. There are various speeches that every child should know about, and some would easily recite. And of course, poetry says in a page what an old takes a book to say. It always appalls me that most Christians have never read any George Herbert, who for me is one of the greatest Christian poets. Love bade me welcome, but my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But sweet-eyed love drew nearer, asking if I lacked anything. I guess, said I, worthy to be here. You shall be he, said love. I, the unkind, the unclean, I cannot look on thee. And who made the eyes but I, said love. Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let me go where my sin does deserve, and I will serve. Love said, you shall sit down and eat my meat. So I did sit and eat. Christian life in a few lines. Why don't people learn more poetry? Why don't you learn something this week? Try George Herbert. The Pulley or Love 3 would be the two that I would suggest you start with. Blessings on you all.